He never stopped on highways. Not for strangers. Not for uncertainty. But the woman standing beside his children was neither. Ethan Caldwell had built his life on momentum. His world functioned on schedules, acquisitions, and forward motion, and the black Mercedes moving along Route 9 that October afternoon was simply another extension of that control. The sky hung low and metallic, threatening rain, while muted fields blurred past his tinted windows. He was mentally rehearsing numbers for a Manhattan investment meeting when something on the roadside interrupted the rhythm of certainty he depended on. At first it registered as nothing more than movement, a figure near the shoulder, but then the shape sharpened into something that slowed his breathing. It was Marissa Hale, the cleaning lady who had worked at his estate for years, standing against the wind with his 2 children beside her. The sight made him ease his foot off the accelerator without fully understanding why. Olivia stood closest to Marissa, her small hand wrapped tightly around the woman's fingers, while Noah hovered just behind them with his backpack slipping from one shoulder. Neither child was crying. That absence of noise unsettled him more than any dramatic scene would have. Ethan pulled the car onto the shoulder with controlled precision, stepped out, and let the cold air hit his face. The scent of damp leaves and asphalt filled his lungs as he walked toward them, already calculating explanations before hearing one. "Why are my children standing on the side of a highway?" he asked, his tone even, executive, practiced. Marissa met his gaze without defensiveness, but there was exhaustion in her eyes, the kind that came from holding something heavy alone. She explained softly that the children had refused to go back to the house. Olivia, usually composed beyond her years, looked smaller in that moment, as if the wind itself had worn her down. When Ethan asked why they weren't at school, Noah admitted that he had told a teacher his father didn't come home unless it was late and that Olivia hadn't spoken during class for weeks. The school had called. Marissa had answered. The children had asked her to walk with them instead of returning to the estate. The word home sounded different when Olivia whispered it. It carried hesitation instead of comfort. Ethan felt irritation first, the reflex of a man who believed provision equaled love, but beneath it something colder formed. He looked at the highway stretching ahead, at the meeting he was about to miss, and then at his children who seemed almost relieved simply that he had stopped. That realization unsettled him more than any accusation could have. Marissa finally said what neither child would: they were afraid of becoming invisible inside their own house. The statement lingered in the gray air between them. Ethan opened the car doors without another word, and the children climbed in quietly. As he drove toward the estate, the silence in the back seat felt heavier than the weight of any corporate negotiation he had ever carried. When the iron gates opened and the mansion appeared illuminated against the dim sky, it no longer looked like legacy, it looked like distance built in stone. Olivia hesitated before stepping out of the car, her voice barely audible when she said she didn't want to go inside. Ethan looked at the towering windows differently now, sensing that something fragile had been unraveling in those rooms long before this roadside encounter. Marissa turned to him one last time before they entered. There was something she hadn't yet said, something that deepened the tension rather than resolved it. Ethan felt, for the first time since his wife Claire's death 3 years earlier, that he was not in control of the narrative unfolding around him. And as the front doors opened and the quiet foyer received them, he sensed that the truth waiting inside that house would not challenge his wealth, but his identity as a father. Because what lay hidden within those walls was not rebellion, it was a letter that would question everything he believed about love, legacy, and the way he had survived his grief. He never stopped on highways. Not for strangers. Not for uncertainty. But the woman standing beside his children was neither. Ethan Caldwell had built his life on momentum. His world functioned on schedules, acquisitions, and forward motion, and the black Mercedes moving along Route 9 that October afternoon was simply another extension of that control. The sky hung low and metallic, threatening rain, while muted fields blurred past his tinted windows. He was mentally rehearsing numbers for a Manhattan investment meeting when something on the roadside interrupted the rhythm of certainty he depended on. At first it registered as nothing more than movement, a figure near the shoulder, but then the shape sharpened into something that slowed his breathing. It was Marissa Hale, the cleaning lady who had worked at his estate for years, standing against the wind with his 2 children beside her. The sight made him ease his foot off the accelerator without fully understanding why. Olivia stood closest to Marissa, her small hand wrapped tightly around the woman's fingers, while Noah hovered just behind them with his backpack slipping from one shoulder. Neither child was crying. That absence of noise unsettled him more than any dramatic scene would have. Ethan pulled the car onto the shoulder with controlled precision, stepped out, and let the cold air hit his face. The scent of damp leaves and asphalt filled his lungs as he walked toward them, already calculating explanations before hearing one. "Why are my children standing on the side of a highway?" he asked, his tone even, executive, practiced. Marissa met his gaze without defensiveness, but there was exhaustion in her eyes, the kind that came from holding something heavy alone. She explained softly that the children had refused to go back to the house. Olivia, usually composed beyond her years, looked smaller in that moment, as if the wind itself had worn her down. When Ethan asked why they weren't at school, Noah admitted that he had told a teacher his father didn't come home unless it was late and that Olivia hadn't spoken during class for weeks. The school had called. Marissa had answered. The children had asked her to walk with them instead of returning to the estate. The word home sounded different when Olivia whispered it. It carried hesitation instead of comfort. Ethan felt irritation first, the reflex of a man who believed provision equaled love, but beneath it something colder formed. He looked at the highway stretching ahead, at the meeting he was about to miss, and then at his children who seemed almost relieved simply that he had stopped. That realization unsettled him more than any accusation could have. Marissa finally said what neither child would: they were afraid of becoming invisible inside their own house. The statement lingered in the gray air between them. Ethan opened the car doors without another word, and the children climbed in quietly. As he drove toward the estate, the silence in the back seat felt heavier than the weight of any corporate negotiation he had ever carried. When the iron gates opened and the mansion appeared illuminated against the dim sky, it no longer looked like legacy, it looked like distance built in stone. Olivia hesitated before stepping out of the car, her voice barely audible when she said she didn't want to go inside. Ethan looked at the towering windows differently now, sensing that something fragile had been unraveling in those rooms long before this roadside encounter. Marissa turned to him one last time before they entered. There was something she hadn't yet said, something that deepened the tension rather than resolved it. Ethan felt, for the first time since his wife Claire's death 3 years earlier, that he was not in control of the narrative unfolding around him. And as the front doors opened and the quiet foyer received them, he sensed that the truth waiting inside that house would not challenge his wealth, but his identity as a father. Because what lay hidden within those walls was not rebellion, it was a letter that would question everything he believed about love, legacy, and the way he had survived his grief. It was never addressed to him. It was never meant for his eyes. But grief has a way of rearranging what belongs to whom. The laundry room was the most ordinary space in the Caldwell estate, which was perhaps why the discovery felt so destabilizing. There were no chandeliers here, no polished marble, no portraits of generational pride, just the low hum of machines, the scent of detergent, and neatly folded stacks of linen that Marissa had arranged with quiet precision for years. Ethan stepped inside with restrained impatience, still carrying the weight of Olivia's drawing in his mind. Marissa closed the door gently behind them, sealing the room in a silence that felt intentional. She placed a folded letter on the counter between them. "I found it months ago," she said. "I didn't know when to give it to you." Ethan's pulse shifted, not panic, but awareness. He recognized Claire's handwriting immediately. The soft, deliberate curve of her letters. The way she pressed harder on certain strokes when she was emotional. The letter was not addressed to him. It was addressed to Marissa. He felt something sharp rise in his chest, not jealousy, not yet, but displacement. His wife had written something significant and entrusted it to someone else. "Why didn't she give it to me?" he asked quietly. Marissa did not answer. She simply nodded toward the paper. Ethan unfolded it slowly, aware that whatever it contained had already shaped the household in ways he did not fully understand. Marissa. If you're reading this, it means I didn't get the time I hoped for. I need you to watch them closely. Ethan loves them deeply, but he doesn't always know how to stay still long enough to show it. If grief turns him inward, remind him who he was before fear made him chase control. And if the children begin to fade in his shadow, step in until he finds his way back. I trust you. Claire. The words did not accuse. They revealed. Ethan read the letter twice, the hum of the dryer filling the space between each sentence. Claire's tone was not bitter. It was protective. There was love in the lines, love for him, even in her concern. That realization hurt more than criticism would have. She thought I would fail, he said finally, though the statement lacked conviction. She thought you would hurt, Marissa replied gently. And that you wouldn't know how to handle it. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, remembering the hospital room again, the sterile air, the steady beeping of machines, the way he had promised Claire he would keep everything stable. He had interpreted stability as financial security. Claire had clearly meant something else. There's more, Marissa said, stepping toward a small cabinet in the corner. She retrieved a narrow wooden box, blue cedar, worn at the edges. She asked me to keep this safe. Ethan stared at it, recognition surfacing slowly. It had once sat in Claire's reading room. He had assumed it contained personal keepsakes, nothing urgent. He opened it carefully. Inside were legal documents. Guardianship provisions. Trust amendments. A conditional clause tied to the children's emotional welfare. If signs of paternal neglect or emotional endangerment emerged, temporary custodial authority could shift, not permanently, but protectively, to a designated guardian. Marissa Hale. The language was measured, precise, and legally binding. Ethan felt heat rise to his face, not rage, but exposure. His empire was structured around risk management, yet Claire had implemented her own contingency plan within their family. She had prepared for the possibility that grief might hollow him out. You never told me, he said, his voice quieter now. She didn't want you to feel replaced, Marissa answered. She wanted you protected from yourself. The phrasing settled heavily. Protected from yourself. He leaned back against the counter, the room feeling smaller than before. For years he had believed he was preserving Claire's legacy by expanding the company, securing generational wealth, maintaining the estate as she had left it. But Claire had not been concerned about market share. She had been concerned about memory. About identity. About whether her children would grow up emotionally intact. Did she think I didn't love them? He asked. Marissa met his gaze steadily. She knew you loved them. She was afraid you'd bury that love under survival. The dryer clicked off, and the sudden stillness felt symbolic. Ethan imagined Claire writing that letter, perhaps late at night, perhaps after he had fallen asleep beside a laptop glowing with spreadsheets. Had she watched him drift without knowing how to pull him back? Had she already sensed the widening distance between him and the children? She was sick longer than she told me, he said slowly, piecing together fragments of memory, her fatigue, her insistence that he not cancel meetings, her quiet smiles when he promised to slow down after this quarter. Marissa hesitated before responding. She didn't want your last months together to be filled with fear. The realization struck like a delayed echo. Claire had carried knowledge of her condition alone. Not to deceive him. To protect him. Ethan placed the documents back into the cedar box carefully, as if the act itself required reverence. He felt no anger toward Marissa now. Only an unsettling gratitude. She had not overstepped. She had obeyed Claire's wishes. She had stepped in quietly when needed, attending school meetings, supervising homework, offering warmth where there had been space. "Why tell me now?" he asked. "Because today was the first time they chose to leave the house," Marissa said. And that's when her contingency becomes real. The statement hung in the air, factual and devastating. For the first time, Ethan understood that this was not a threat to his authority. It was a mirror held up to his absence. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked softly, one of the children shifting in their sleep. The sound grounded him. They were still here. Still reachable. He closed the cedar box and exhaled slowly. "I won't lose them," he said, though the vow felt less like determination and more like fear. Marissa nodded. "Then don't fight this. Learn from it." He looked at her differently now, not as staff, not as subordinate, but as witness. She had seen his children cry. She had seen them wait. She had carried Claire's trust quietly for months. And now the burden of that trust was his to reclaim. As he stepped out of the laundry room and into the dim hallway, Ethan felt the architecture of his certainty shifting. The estate no longer felt like a monument to success. It felt like a test he had been failing without realizing. He moved toward Claire's old reading room, the cedar box still in his hands. There were questions forming now, about her final months, about what else she had kept from him, about whether love sometimes disguises truth as protection. Because if Claire had prepared legally for his emotional absence, what else had she prepared for? And as Ethan opened the door to her reading room, the faint scent of her perfume still lingering in the air, he sensed that the answers waiting inside would not simply challenge his pride. They would redefine his understanding of their marriage. And hidden within her desk was a medical file that would prove Claire had been protecting far more than the children. Some betrayals are loud and reckless. Others are quiet acts of love. And sometimes the truth hurts not because it was hidden, but because it was carried alone. Claire's reading room had remained untouched since the week of her funeral. Ethan had ordered it preserved, as if freezing the space would freeze the grief inside it. The curtains were still half drawn the way she preferred, allowing a filtered wash of late afternoon light to spill across the worn leather chair where she used to sit with a book resting gently against her chest. The air carried the faint trace of her perfume, something floral and understated that made his throat tighten before he even crossed the room. He placed the cedar box on her desk and slowly opened the top drawer. Inside lay a thin folder he did not recognize. His name was not on it. Neither was hers. Instead, it bore the letterhead of a cardiology specialist in Manhattan. His fingers hesitated for only a second before he opened it. The diagnosis was dated 11 months before her death. Progressive heart failure. Advanced. Limited treatment options. He stared at the page longer than necessary, as if the medical language might rearrange itself into something less final. The dates blurred first, then sharpened again. 11 months. Nearly a year in which she had known something he did not. He sank into the chair slowly, the leather creaking beneath him, and read further. Notes from consultations. Risk assessments. Recommendations for reduced stress. The file contained evidence of careful planning, not panic. Claire had approached her mortality the way she approached everything else in life, deliberately. He searched the room for anger and found none. Instead, there was a hollow recognition settling into place. She had known. And she had chosen not to tell him. He flipped to the back of the folder and found a smaller notebook tucked inside. It was Claire's handwriting again, but this time the entries were dated across several months. The journal did not read like confession. It read like preparation. I watch him build as if expansion will protect us from loss. I don't know how to tell him that slowing down might protect us more. Another entry weeks later. If I tell Ethan now, he will abandon everything to sit beside me. I don't want our final year to feel like a waiting room. I want laughter at dinner. I want normal mornings. I want him to remember me strong. The words pressed against his chest with unbearable clarity. She had not hidden the truth to exclude him. She had hidden it to preserve something fragile, dignity, perhaps, or the illusion of ordinary life. He remembered the months before she died. Her insistence that he keep his travel schedule. The way she brushed off fatigue with a smile. The time he offered to cancel a conference and she insisted he go, telling him she felt fine. He had believed her. Or perhaps he had wanted to. The realization unfolded slowly: Claire had protected him from helplessness. She had known that if he understood the severity of her condition, he would attempt to control it the only way he knew how, with intervention, with resources, with relentless action. And when control failed, as it inevitably would have, he might have shattered in front of the children. She had shielded them from that version of him. And now, standing in the quiet room she once loved, he felt both grateful and undone. There was another envelope inside the desk drawer. This one bore his name. He opened it carefully. Ethan. If you're reading this, then you've found what I couldn't bring myself to say aloud. I didn't tell you because I know how you love, you would have tried to fix it. Some things aren't meant to be fixed. They're meant to be held gently. Promise me you won't disappear when I'm gone. Don't hide inside the company. Don't turn grief into expansion. The children need the version of you that laughs without checking the time. Stay. The final word was underlined once. Stay. The simplicity of it dismantled him more thoroughly than any diagnosis. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, and for the first time since the funeral, allowed himself to cry without restraint. Not the controlled tears of a widower greeting condolences. Not the silent grief of a man who believes strength equals composure. This was different, raw, unguarded, heavy. Marissa appeared quietly at the doorway but did not step inside. She understood instinctively that this moment belonged to him. She loved you fiercely, she said softly when he finally looked up. I should have known, he replied, his voice rough. You knew she was tired, Marissa answered carefully. You just didn't know why. Ethan exhaled shakily. She didn't give me the chance to carry it with her. Marissa considered that before responding. Maybe she believed you were already carrying too much. The statement was not criticism. It was observation. He thought of the year she had been sick. The mergers he had closed. The travel he had justified. The way he had mistaken her calm for stability rather than courage. She asked me to remind you to stay, Marissa continued. Not because she doubted you. Because she knew grief would tempt you to run. He closed the journal slowly, pressing his palm against the cover as if anchoring it to the present. Claire had not left him unprepared. She had left instructions. Emotional instructions, not financial ones. Down the hallway, he heard the faint murmur of the children's voices. A whisper, a giggle, then quiet. They were still here. Still within reach. Ethan stood, folding the letter carefully and placing it back inside the envelope. He did not return the folder to the drawer. Instead, he carried it with him as he stepped out into the hall. Tomorrow, he said quietly, more to himself than to Marissa, I'm canceling Chicago. Marissa studied him carefully, assessing whether this was reaction or intention. And the board meeting, she asked. He paused. For the first time, he said, it can wait. She nodded once, understanding that this was not a grand gesture. It was a shift in hierarchy. As he walked toward the children's rooms, the weight inside him had changed. The grief remained, but it was no longer an abstract force pushing him forward into distraction. It had become directive. Stay. He entered Noah's room first. The small lamp on the nightstand cast a warm circle of light. Noah stirred slightly when Ethan sat on the edge of the bed. Dad, he murmured sleepily. I'm here, Ethan replied. And for once, he meant more than physically present. When he stepped into Olivia's room afterward, she was still awake, staring at the ceiling. Did you find something? She asked quietly. He sat beside her and nodded. I found out your mom was braver than I knew. Olivia turned toward him slowly. Are you going to leave again tomorrow? He hesitated only a fraction of a second. No. The answer felt unfamiliar on his tongue, not because it was untrue, but because it signaled change. As he left her room and closed the door gently behind him, Ethan sensed the first fragile thread of redemption taking form. Not dramatic. Not visible from the outside. But real. Yet transformation rarely goes unnoticed. The next morning, when he entered his Manhattan office and informed the board that he would be restructuring his time indefinitely, their reaction was not supportive. It was strategic. Because power does not pause easily. And while Ethan was learning how to stay, others were calculating how to replace him. By the end of the week, the very company he had built would question whether grief had made him unfit to lead, and the vote they were preparing would force him to choose between control and family once and for all. They built the empire with him, but they never built the grief. And when a man changes his priorities, the board calls it instability. The Manhattan skyline looked indifferent that morning, glass towers catching pale winter light as if nothing personal had ever unfolded inside them. Ethan stood in his corner office at Caldwell Holdings, staring down at the city that had once fueled him. For years, these windows had represented ascent, proof that control could be engineered, expanded, secured. Today, they felt like observation panels in a room where he was being studied. The emergency board meeting had been called within 48 hours of his announcement that he would be reducing his operational oversight. Officially, it was framed as a discussion about long-term strategic continuity. Unofficially, it was about whether grief had compromised the founder. The conference room filled gradually, tailored suits, measured expressions, polished concern. Men and women who had trusted him with billions. Partners who admired his decisiveness. Investors who equated leadership with relentless forward motion. Ethan took his seat at the head of the table without ceremony. Harold Whitmore, the senior board member and longtime confidant of Ethan's late father, cleared his throat first. We've observed recent behavioral shifts, he began carefully. Cancelled travel. Delegated negotiations. A delay in the Chicago expansion. Correct, Ethan replied evenly. May we ask the cause? There it was, the corporate phrasing that disguised judgment as curiosity. My children, Ethan said simply. A brief silence followed. Not hostile. Analytical. We are sympathetic, another member added. But Caldwell Holdings cannot operate on fluctuating availability. Ethan folded his hands on the table. The company has a full executive team. Growth does not require my constant presence. Harold leaned forward slightly. It has always required your vision. The statement might once have flattered him. Today, it sounded like dependency dressed as loyalty. My vision, Ethan responded, has expanded. A few glances exchanged across the table. He knew what they were thinking. That grief had softened him. That emotional recalibration signaled weakness. That stepping back meant surrendering dominance in a market that rewarded aggression. What exactly are you proposing? Ethan asked. The answer came measured and prepared. A temporary interim CEO, Harold said. 1 year. Stability for shareholders while you recalibrate. The word lingered. Recalibrate. As if fatherhood were a malfunction. Ethan considered the implications calmly. A year ago, he would have fought. He would have cited quarterly growth, competitive positioning, loyalty to founding principles. He would have tightened his grip on control until no one dared suggest otherwise. Instead, he found himself thinking of no accounting headlights. Of Olivia drawing him outside the house. Of Claire's underlined word, stay. What happens to the family trust structure? He asked. Harold blinked, momentarily surprised by the direction of the question. It remains intact. Your ownership stake is unchanged. This is operational, not structural. Ethan nodded once. And if I agree, he continued, the company proceeds without disruption. Yes. The room waited. He thought of legacy, the word his father had revered, the word he himself had weaponized as motivation. Legacy had always meant expansion. Influence. Market dominance. But perhaps legacy could also mean something quieter. Something human. I will step aside, Ethan said. The response landed heavier than any refusal might have. Harold sat back slowly. You're certain? Yes. There was no tremor in his voice. No visible regret. He was not surrendering his company. He was redefining its hierarchy in his life. The meeting concluded with procedural formalities. An interim CEO would be appointed. Public statements would frame the shift as strategic evolution. Investors would be reassured. Ethan signed the necessary documents without drama. As he left the building, the winter air felt sharper than it had in months. He had expected panic. Instead, he felt something unexpectedly light, as if relinquishing constant control had unburdened him rather than diminished him. He drove north without turning on the radio, letting the road fill the silence. He passed the stretch of Route 9 where he had first seen Marissa standing with his children. The shoulder looked ordinary now, unremarkable. Yet it had altered everything. When he reached the estate, the front door was open. Laughter drifted out. Inside, the kitchen lights glowed warmly. Olivia sat at the counter working on homework while Noah attempted to stir something in a mixing bowl far too vigorously. Flour dusted the marble surface. Marissa stood beside him, gently correcting his enthusiasm. Ethan paused in the doorway, absorbing the scene. It was imperfect. Slightly chaotic. Alive. You're home early, Marissa observed, mild surprise in her tone. I'm home, he replied. The distinction mattered. Olivia looked up first. Are you leaving again tonight? No. She studied him carefully, as if testing for cracks in the promise. Noah ran toward him, arms flung wide, leaving faint traces of flour on Ethan's dark coat when he collided against him. Ethan laughed, a sound that felt unused. What did you make? He asked. Cookies, Noah declared proudly. Mom's recipe. The word hung in the air, Mom. It didn't fracture the room. It anchored it. Later that evening, after dinner plates were cleared and homework reviewed, Ethan found himself sitting on the porch where Claire used to drink tea at sunset. The sky was streaked with muted orange fading into violet, the estate grounds quiet beneath early frost. Marissa stepped outside with 2 mugs and handed one to him without speaking. You did it, she said eventually. Yes. Are you afraid? He considered the question honestly. Less than I expected. She nodded. Power can feel safer than vulnerability. He looked out over the driveway where headlights once symbolized absence. I thought providing was enough, he admitted. And now? Now I think staying is harder. Marissa smiled faintly. It is. They sat in companionable silence for a moment before she added, the board won't see this as strength. They don't have to, Ethan replied. Inside the house, Olivia's voice called for help with a math problem. The sound cut through the quiet evening like invitation. Ethan stood immediately. Ethan remained seated a moment longer, understanding that power and presence were no longer competing forces in his life. One would have to redefine itself to accommodate the other. But the markets would not wait quietly. By the end of the week, major shareholders would call for a formal stability review, and the interim CEO, once temporary, would begin consolidating influence behind polished smiles and private meetings. Ethan had chosen to stay. Now he would learn whether staying could withstand scrutiny. Because the next battle would not be fought in silence. It would be fought under public light. And when investors demanded proof that he was still strong, Ethan would have to decide whether strength meant reclaiming control, or surrendering it completely. They expected him to defend his empire. They did not expect him to redefine it. The shareholder review was scheduled for Friday morning, positioned delicately before market open so that reaction could be managed before volatility had time to breathe. Ethan arrived at Caldwell Holdings without entourage or announcement, walking through the glass lobby that once amplified his presence with subtle awe. Employees still straightened when he passed, but the energy had shifted. Curiosity replaced certainty. Rumors traveled faster than earnings reports, and everyone understood that the question hovering over the building was no longer about quarterly growth but about permanence. Inside the main conference hall, institutional investors appeared on large digital screens while board members gathered along the polished mahogany table. The interim CEO, Daniel Mercer, stood composed near the front, projecting steadiness without ambition too openly displayed. Daniel had been with the company for years, capable, intelligent, patient. A safe option. The kind of leader markets trusted because he rarely surprised them. Ethan took his seat, not at the head of the table this time, but along its length. The adjustment was subtle but symbolic. He was not here to reclaim a throne. He was here to clarify direction. Harold Whitmore opened the session with formal remarks about continuity and stability. Then the questions began, framed respectfully yet sharpened by financial interest. Mr. Caldwell, one investor began, "Do you intend to resume full executive control within the year?" The phrasing implied expectation rather than inquiry. Ethan folded his hands calmly. "No," he answered. A ripple passed through the screens, muted reactions, exchanged glances. "Can you elaborate?" another voice pressed. "I founded this company with the belief that strength meant oversight," Ethan continued, his tone steady but measured with introspection. "Relentless expansion. Direct control over every strategic decision. That approach built extraordinary growth. It also built a version of leadership dependent on a single axis." He paused just long enough for the weight of the admission to settle. "My absence over the past weeks has not weakened Caldwell Holdings. It has revealed that it is capable of functioning without constant central authority. That is not instability. That is maturity." Daniel Mercer shifted slightly but remained silent. An investor leaned forward on the screen. "And your personal circumstances? Should we expect further withdrawal?" Ethan did not flinch at the wording. "You should expect clarity. I lost my wife 3 years ago. I believed protecting my children meant expanding the security around them. I've since realized security is not synonymous with presence. I will not confuse those again." The room grew quieter, not because of scandal but because of candor. Corporate environments were unaccustomed to vulnerability that did not seek leverage. Harold interjected carefully. "To confirm, are you endorsing Daniel Mercer as permanent CEO?" Ethan looked toward Daniel for the first time directly. There was no rivalry in his gaze. Only recognition. "Yes," he said. The answer landed with finality. Some investors appeared relieved. Others cautious. But no one could accuse him of instability now. His decision was deliberate, not reactive. "What role will you retain?" someone asked. "Chairman," Ethan replied. "Strategic oversight without operational immersion. I will contribute vision, not velocity." The distinction mattered. The meeting extended another hour, filled with procedural confirmations and strategic reassurances. By the time it concluded, market analysts were already reframing the narrative. Headlines began shifting from speculation about weakness to commentary on succession planning and long-term governance. What had once been cast as emotional fragility now appeared as strategic evolution. But for Ethan, the most important audience was not present in that room. He left Manhattan before lunch and drove north under a sky clearing from winter gray into hesitant sunlight. When he reached the estate, he found Olivia sitting at the dining table with a history book open and Noah sprawled across the floor with colored pencils scattered around him. Marissa stood near the stove, the faint scent of rosemary and roasted chicken filling the house with warmth. "How did it go?" she asked, searching his face for signs of fracture. "I stepped down," he said simply. Olivia looked up. "Does that mean you're home more?" "Yes." Noah frowned slightly. "Is that bad?" Ethan crossed the room and knelt beside him. "It's different." "Not bad." Marissa studied him quietly. "Permanent?" "Yes." There was no tremor in his voice this time. No second-guessing. The decision felt integrated rather than abrupt. That evening, the four of them drove back to the stretch of Route 9 where everything had shifted weeks earlier. The shoulder looked ordinary, no marker, no sign commemorating revelation. Just asphalt and open field. Ethan pulled over deliberately this time. They stepped out together. The wind moved through dry winter grass, softer now than before. Olivia slipped her hand into his without hesitation. Noah stood close enough that their sleeves brushed. "This is where you found us," Olivia said. "No," Ethan corrected gently. "This is where I stopped." The nuance lingered. Marissa stood slightly behind them, giving the moment space. The highway hummed faintly in the distance, cars moving forward as they always would. But for Ethan, the significance of stillness had rewritten something fundamental. He turned toward his children. "I thought strength meant never slowing down," he admitted. "I was wrong." Olivia squeezed his hand. "You stopped." "Yes." The word felt larger than its syllables. They returned to the car as dusk began folding over the horizon. When they arrived back at the estate, the house lights glowed warmly against the darkening sky. It no longer resembled a monument to legacy. It resembled a lived-in promise. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, Ethan stood alone in the foyer beneath Claire's portrait. The oil painting captured her mid-laugh, head tilted slightly, eyes alive with warmth. He studied it without the sharp ache that once accompanied the image. Grief had not vanished. It had repositioned itself, less an adversary, more a guide. "I stayed," he said quietly. In the stillness, he imagined she would have understood. Upstairs, a door creaked as one of the children shifted in sleep. The sound anchored him more securely than any shareholder approval ever had. Caldwell Holdings would continue under new leadership. Analysts would debate the wisdom of his choice. Markets would rise and fall as they always did. But inside the estate, something steadier had taken root. As he walked toward the door, he understood something with clarity he had not possessed before. Stepping down had not reduced his authority. It had redirected it. But transformation is rarely uncontested. The media would soon speculate about his withdrawal. Investors would question stability. And someone within the boardroom had already begun positioning the interim arrangement as permanent. Ethan might have chosen family over dominance. But dominance rarely releases its grip without consequence. And within days, a public article would frame his decision not as devotion, but as decline, forcing him to confront whether redemption can survive reputation. The headlines didn't mention his children. They mentioned weakness. And in the world Ethan built, weakness was the only unforgivable sin. The article surfaced just after dawn, released into the financial bloodstream of Manhattan before the markets fully opened. Ethan did not discover it through outrage or alarm but through a forwarded message from a senior advisor whose subject line read simply, "We need to manage this." Sitting at the long oak kitchen table where sunlight now reached more often than conference calls, Ethan opened the link and absorbed the language with the same precision he once reserved for contracts. The headline was restrained yet deliberate, crafted to suggest instability without ever stating it outright. It spoke of leadership recalibration, of investor concern, of a founder whose recent withdrawal raised questions about long-term strategic direction. It cited unnamed sources who described him as distracted. It praised his past decisiveness in contrast with his present restraint. The implication was surgical. Ethan Caldwell, once relentless, had softened. Across from him, Olivia zipped her backpack. Noah dragged a spoon through the final arc of milk at the bottom of his cereal bowl. The morning smelled of toast and coffee rather than urgency. Neither child noticed the article glowing coldly against the warmth of the kitchen. Marissa did. She read the subtle shift in his posture, the quiet narrowing of his gaze, the pause that lasted a fraction too long before he locked the screen. "They move fast," she said gently. "They always have," he replied, though there was no admiration in his tone. He understood the mechanics of narrative. For decades he had shaped them himself, earnings reports framed as triumph, acquisitions described as vision, risk recast as innovation. He knew how perception functioned in financial ecosystems. What unsettled him was not the article's existence but its framing. His decision to remain home, to attend school drop-offs, to reclaim evenings once consumed by negotiation, these were described not as devotion but as deviation. Devotion did not trend upward on stock charts. Stability did. After driving the children to school, an act still novel enough to feel intentional, Ethan returned home instead of heading south to Manhattan. The estate felt different now during daylight hours, less like a monument and more like a residence. He stepped into Claire's reading room not in search of hidden files but in search of clarity. The chair where he had wept days earlier now faced a garden beginning to frost. He stood at the window and considered the trajectory unfolding beyond the walls of the house. His phone vibrated in his hand. Harold Whitmore. "I assume you've seen it," Harold began without preamble, his voice measured but strained beneath the professionalism. "Yes. It's not from the board," Harold added quickly. "But perception spreads." Ethan watched a groundskeeper move methodically across the lawn, unaware of shareholder sentiment or financial headlines. "Perception built this company," he said quietly. "But it isn't raising my children." A brief silence followed, heavy with the unspoken tension of generational expectation. Harold had known Ethan's father. He had watched Caldwell Holdings evolve from a regional enterprise into a multinational force. To Harold, relentlessness equaled survival. "This isn't about family," Harold said carefully. "It's about maintaining control." The word lingered in the air after the call ended. Control. For years it had defined Ethan's identity. Control over risk. Control over growth. Control over outcomes that most men considered unpredictable. Now he found himself questioning whether control had ever truly extended to the places that mattered most. He could counter the article easily. A public statement reaffirming commitment. A strategic appearance with analysts. An accelerated deal to prove he remained decisive. The tools were familiar. Effective. But they would require late nights again. Absence. A return to the version of himself Claire had quietly feared grief would produce. The front door opened softly mid-morning, and Marissa entered carrying a slim folder from the Children's Academy. She explained that Dr. Rowe had noticed changes, subtle but promising. Olivia had volunteered to read aloud in class. Noah no longer hesitated when other children approached him. Their participation had returned not through therapy or intervention, but through presence. The word resonated. Participation. Not performance. Not perfection. Participation. Ethan sat at the kitchen table and opened a different set of documents, personal legal drafts. If the board intended to test the permanence of his recalibration, he would respond not with aggression but with clarity. He revised guardianship provisions transparently. He removed the quiet contingency that had once empowered Marissa conditionally and replaced it with formal acknowledgement of her role as emotional safeguard in the children's lives. There would be no secrecy, no shadow clauses. Accountability would exist in daylight. When the children returned home that afternoon, the estate carried a softness it had lacked for years. Olivia burst through the door with flushed cheeks, announcing that she had answered a difficult question in front of her entire class. Noah followed, asking if his father would still be present at tomorrow's pickup. Ethan answered yes without hesitation. There was no grand speech attached to the promise. Just consistency. Later that evening, another article surfaced, sharper this time, speculating whether Caldwell Holdings could sustain momentum without its founder's constant oversight. Financial commentators debated his emotional reprioritization as though it were a liability on a balance sheet. Social media dissected his supposed decline. Ethan read none of it. Instead, he knelt on the living room rug constructing a cardboard solar system with Noah, adhesive tape clinging stubbornly to his fingers while glitter dusted his cuffs. Olivia sprawled nearby with a history textbook, occasionally glancing over as if confirming that this version of him remained intact. The house felt illuminated from within rather than by exterior lighting. When the children finally went upstairs and the estate quieted, Marissa found him on the porch where Claire once drank tea at sunset. Frost silvered the grass. The air carried the stillness of early winter. "You're not going to answer them?" she asked gently. "Not every narrative deserves correction," he replied. "And if they replace you?" He considered the possibility without flinching. "Then they replace a man who measured strength incorrectly." The porch light cast a steady glow across the driveway where headlights once symbolized distance. Now it symbolized return. Inside, the children's bedroom lamps flicked off one by one.
And for the first time since Claire's death, Ethan no longer measured his legacy in expansion. He measured it in presence. Yet one final act remained, one that would transform wealth itself into something Claire would recognize. Because stepping down was only the beginning. Now he would have to decide what his fortune was truly for. And the announcement he planned for spring would redefine not only his company's legacy, but his family's future. Legacy is not what you leave behind when you're gone. It is what glows while you are still here. Spring arrived slowly in Westchester, thawing the frost from the estate grounds and softening the hard edges of winter that had once mirrored Ethan's interior life. The Caldwell house no longer felt like a preserved monument to what had been lost. It felt inhabited in a way that was imperfect, lived in and warm. Morning light entered through open curtains instead of heavy drapes, and the kitchen carried the scent of coffee and cinnamon more often than the sterile quiet of polished marble. The shift was subtle to an outsider, but to Ethan it felt architectural, as though the foundation of the house itself had adjusted. Caldwell Holdings had stabilized under Daniel Mercer's leadership. The markets, always hungry for reassurance, had reframed Ethan's departure as visionary succession rather than retreat. Analysts praised the structural maturity of a founder willing to decentralize authority. What they could not quantify, however, was the quieter reconstruction taking place inside the estate each evening. Olivia now spoke freely at the dinner table, describing school projects without glancing first at the clock. Noah no longer counted headlights from his bedroom window. Instead, he waited near the door when he heard Ethan's car in the driveway, confident in its predictability. Marissa moved through the house not as an invisible employee, but as a trusted presence woven naturally into its rhythm. There was no awkwardness in her role now. It had been clarified, acknowledged, honored. One evening in early April, Ethan gathered them in the living room beneath Claire's portrait. The fire crackled gently in the hearth, casting amber light across the walls. The atmosphere carried anticipation, though no one had been told why. "I have something to share," Ethan began, his tone calm but weighted with intention. Olivia tucked her legs beneath her. Noah leaned against the arm of the sofa. Marissa stood slightly apart at first, until Ethan gestured for her to sit with them. "For a long time," he continued, "I believed this house and the company were the most important parts of what your mother and I built. I was wrong." The children listened without interruption. "I've decided to dedicate a significant portion of Caldwell Holdings' future profits to something new, something in your mother's name." Olivia's eyes widened slightly. "Like a building?" "Not exactly," Ethan said with a faint smile. A foundation. Community centers focused on grief support for families. Counseling. Spaces where children who lose someone don't have to feel alone inside their own homes. The room stilled. He continued, choosing his words carefully. Your mother protected us from fear in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. I want to honor that by helping other families learn how to stay with each other when things feel unbearable. Noah frowned thoughtfully. Like when I waited at the window? Yes, Ethan replied softly. Like that. Marissa's eyes shimmered, but she did not interrupt. She understood the magnitude of what he was doing, not just financially but philosophically. Wealth, once guarded as legacy, was being redirected toward empathy. The first center will open here, Ethan added. In Westchester. On land we own near the lake. Olivia leaned forward. Can we help? You already are, he said. The following weeks unfolded with deliberate purpose. Architects visited the property near the lake. Legal teams structured the foundation. Press releases were drafted, but this time the narrative felt aligned rather than defensive. When the public announcement came, it carried a different tone from the articles that had once speculated about his weakness. It described a founder reshaping corporate success into community responsibility. Analysts praised the philanthropic strategy as forward-thinking brand positioning. Some cynics questioned motives. But Ethan no longer built his choices around external validation. On the day construction officially began, the families stood together at the lakeside property. The water reflected a clear blue sky, rippling gently under a mild breeze. Ethan handed each child a small shovel for the ceremonial groundbreaking. Marissa stood beside them, no longer at the margins of the frame, but firmly within it. As the first turn of soil shifted beneath their hands, Ethan felt something close quietly within him. Not grief, it would never disappear entirely, but regret. The kind that once tightened his chest had softened into memory. Claire's absence remained, but it no longer dictated motion. It informed it. That evening, they returned to the estate tired but content. The house glowed against the twilight, windows illuminated one by one as lamps flickered on inside. Ethan paused in the driveway, recalling the first night he had nearly driven past Marissa and the children on the roadside. He understood now how thin the line had been between continuation and transformation. Had he not stopped, he might have preserved control but lost connection entirely. Olivia opened the car door and ran toward the entrance, laughing. Noah followed close behind. Marissa lingered beside Ethan for a moment. She'd be proud, she said gently. Ethan looked toward Claire's portrait visible faintly through the front window. I hope so. You stayed, Marissa added. He nodded. I did. Inside, the foyer no longer echoed with absence. The house felt alive, imperfectly so, authentically so. Ethan hung his coat without urgency and followed the sound of his children's voices toward the kitchen. Laughter rose easily now, unforced. Later, after bedtime stories and quiet goodnights, he stepped onto the porch alone. The air carried the early warmth of spring, and the driveway lay still beneath the porch light. This was the same place where he once measured success by how late he returned. Now it marked the consistency of his presence. He thought of Claire's final letter, of the underlined word that had dismantled his illusions. Stay. He had mistaken the command for restraint. It had been invitation. Behind him, the house hummed softly with life, appliances cycling, floorboards settling, the faint sound of a child turning in sleep. It was not grand. It was not public. It was not quantifiable. It was enough. Ethan understood finally that legacy was not the estate, nor the corporation, nor even the foundation rising beside the lake. Legacy was this steady illumination from within, a home where children did not count headlights and where grief did not silence love. He stepped back inside and turned off the porch light. The house remained bright.